Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Neo-atheism, in fact, atheism throughout its history, has always promised secular progress. It has promised a utopia wherein human beings would finally flourish, free of the shackles of the mythology and constraints of religious belief. Yet, religion and violence, conversely, are often cited as going hand in hand. The truth of the matter, however, is that we've seen that without moral accountability to God, the 20th century alone has demonstrated that we become bloody. We become the very authors of our own bloodshed. Joining me to have a conversation about this is Dr. Thomas Howard, Dr. Thomas Tal Howard. He is the author of Broken Altars, Secularist Violence in Modern History. He's the professor of Humanities and History and chair of Christian Ethics at Valparaiso University. Tal, it's great to speak with you. Thank you so much for making the time. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Well, I'm joyous to do so, especially given that today we commemorate the feast day of St. Athanasius, and we've been talking about the mystery of the Incarnation. The fact is, Jesus Christ completely transformed the development and trajectory of civilization and history. The past 2,000 years are evidence of that. Now, in the face of this, you have done great work in talking about how when God, especially the God of Christianity, is jettisoned from a societal sphere, what inevitably follows is secularism. And you define three kinds of secularism. So let's broadly define these so that we can proceed with diving deeper.
Sure. Yeah, in my book, Broken Altars, I speak, first of all, of passive secularism, and that is more or less the American model of separation in church and state. And I have fairly positive things to say about that. But two others are more worrisome and I think have led to violence. One is combative secularism. Mm-hmm. This is a more radical rejection of Christianity, the history of iconoclasm and bloodshed against the church going all the way back to the French Revolution. And then finally, I speak of eliminationist secularism, and this is the more Marxist-Leninist variety. Mm-hmm. Of course, Marx famously, called religion the opium of the masses, and the Bolshevik Revolution attempted to operationalize that, or at least hasten it in its attack on the Orthodox Church, but also other forms of Christianity and religion in the Soviet Union.
And so in that light, then, when we talk about passive secularism, we do see some kind of a merit come out of it, and especially within the American constitutional context, because even in the separation of church and state, there's a recognition of the place here in especially mainline Protestantism as one of the pillars that upholds the virtue and moral accountability of society.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I mean, probably one of the great observers of the difference between the American model and the French model is the 19th century intellectual Alexis de Tocqueville, and I think he recognized that while religion was formerly, not part of the state in the United States, it still had a strong role in society and was important for community formation and morality and those types of things.
So in that light, when we talk about, say, the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, when we talk about establishment clauses, we start to understand that there's a very unique way in which this great American experiment has enshrined passive secularism.
Yeah, I would think I would agree with that. The First Amendment captures it well. I think the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights does fairly well, but also the documents of the Second Vatican Council of the Catholic mm-hmm. Church, the document on religious liberty, in some ways echoes the American arrangement.
So then as we develop from there, then we can also look and juxtapose the kind of revolution that took place in America versus, for example, the French Revolution, which is a different kind of secularism.
Yeah, that's true. Especially, the revolution famously starts in 1789 with the storming of the Bastille. But in 1793 and 1794, it took a very Jacobin radical turn that resulted in the destruction of monasteries, the turning of the Church of Notre Dame briefly into the Temple of Reason, essentially a war on Catholics in the Vendée region on western France, and it did turn much more, anti-clerical.
And you see particular attitudes come out of the French Revolution that also begins to reshape the way human persons are thought in light of societies, how societies are thought, and even morality and truth. So tell us more about that.
Well, I think for some of the more radical exponents of the revolution in that phase and the inheritors of that legacy in the 19th century, there was an attempt really to extricate humanity from religion. Christianity, certainly the established church. That becomes an important trajectory of modern political, intellectual development.
How much of the French Revolution's influence do we see in the development of modern eliminationist secularism?
Yeah, I think both eliminationist secularism and combative secularism, as I define them in the book, can be traced back to the French Revolution. But I would say even before that to what the intellectual historian Jonathan Israel calls the radical Enlightenment. And they both possess what I call a stadial understanding of history. So history moves in stages,
right?
From really, if I may simplify greatly, from more religious to more secular and scientific phases of humanity, and that was sort of the utopian promise or delusion, if you will.
And that promise, obviously, we've never seen it delivered. If anything, when we take a look at Nietzsche's The Gay Science and that story of the parable of the madman, we see that he was considerably prophetic. What we saw take place was man's willful, quote-unquote, murder of God, and therefore accountability to a divine source for our morality. And when that was jettisoned, we've seen tremendous bloodshed.
Yeah, I think Nietzsche was quite prophetic in that way. In some ways it is a moral vision, but it's not one that recognizes the human being as having innate dignity and created in the image of God. But it transfers morality to a imminent stadial human project where, famously that if, some eggs need to be broken to make the omelet, so be it. And so, quite tragically, reformers like Lenin, certainly Mao, Asia have a very expendable understanding of the individual human life to realize a larger utopian project.
Tell us more about Lenin and how he jumps upon the Marxist principle, but he really becomes a catalyst for this widespread totalitarian Marxist regime. And his criticism of the thought of people like Gorky, even.
Yes, that's true. In some ways, Karl Marx in the 19th century didn't write that much about religion. He does famously, speak of the opium of the masses, the opium of the people, but he did not necessarily leave a blueprint for how religion would be exercised from human society, but assumed it would as the inexorable march of history went forward. Lenin, I think, and others sort of radicalized this, and they recognized that the Orthodox Church in Russia, which had, a quite, dependent relationship on the Tsar, and certainly, it had its own problems. But he recognized that so long as the Orthodox Church had captured the hearts and minds of people, it was going to be a source of dissent, a source of political dissent. So really beginning, in the early 1920s, he advocated more radical measures. But, to some of his fellow communists like Gorky and others who wanted to come up with some motive of offending with religion, he really felt that that could not be the case. He was, quite insistent on a very sort of radically secular utopian vision.
My guest is Dr. Thomas Howard. He's the author of Broken Altars, Secularist Violence in Modern History. We are continuing this conversation on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Mark Speed. I'm talking with Dr. Thomas Howard, author of Broken Altar, Secularist Violence in Modern History. So, Tal, I want to pick up where we left off, but to jump further ahead, we can start considering different revolutions throughout history. In a particular way, we can think about different versions of modernization, secularization in places like Mexico, Spain, Turkey, and the advancement of the Ottoman Turks. And in light of all of this, what we can begin to see is a real jettisoning of these foundational Judeo-Christian principles about the human person and therefore about culture and society.
That's right. I mean, just to speak of all of these, they're different in some ways, and the term I apply to these is combative, combative secularism. And but the Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century has a strong anti-clerical dimension. The Spanish Civil War, while being no apologist for Franco's side, the Republican side, killed almost 7,000 priests, including 13 bishops. It was quite bloody. And of course, with Turkey, I mean, we're talking about Islam there, but the Kemal Atatürk, the main figure in the Turkish Revolution in the 1920s, really was a kind of a Western imported top-down secularism that was quite draconian in many ways. And as I argue in the book too, this kind of secularist overreach sometimes plays a causal role in inspiring kind of religious extremism at the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah. Graham Greene's The Lawless Roads really does highlight a lot of the events that the Catholic priests and even the Cristeros underwent during this Mexican Revolution. Maybe you can paint a clearer picture for us.
Well, it varied some by state, but like in the state of Tabasco was one of the most extreme. But there were attempts to abolish religious holidays, to kill certain priests, to try to discourage others. And then with the Cristero War, that was similar type of backlash that is inspired by the what I call at several points in the book secularist overreach that does not sit well, especially with some of the lowest and more pious members of society.
Let's talk about Turkey a little bit and the rise of modern Turkey. How you describe them rightly, that secularist overreach describes this revolution well, and how they sought to disestablish religion from the public sphere and also control it.
Yeah, that's right. That control is an important term. I borrow a phrase from the political scientist Timothy Shaw called conflictual integration, and that is where Kemal Atatürk really wanted to bring Islam under the purview of the state, but many traditional elements of Ottoman civilization, the offices of the Sultanate and the Caliphate, the Sufi orders, which were beloved by many people, the famous whirling dervishes.
Yep.
He saw those as politically problematic, and even the hat, the fez that people wore, was abolished in the 1920s and 1930s. And I should say, even in Turkish, they hardly had a word for secularism, but they borrowed the French laïcité, which comes into Turkish as laiklik, I believe. I really not speak Turkish, but it was I'll just use the term draconian, top-down, quite sudden attempt to overthrow many aspects of traditional Turkish Islamic society.
In fact, Kemal, very honestly, it was very explicit that he saw the caliphate as a threat to his desire for an absolute totalitarian reach. And so he was determined to see its removal.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, he did it sort of in two stages. I mean, when the Sultanate was abolished, he made indications that the Caliph, that role as a sort of more of a religious office would continue. But I think you're perfectly right. So long as that existed, it would be a sort of a pole of moral authority outside the purview of the church, almost like sort of a Muslim pope. And I think for his statist ambitions, his nationalism, secularism. He could not abide that, and so it was, to the great regret of many Muslims, it was abolished.
But obviously, Turkey didn't stay that way. In fact, there was kind of reaction. Some might call it an overreaction to Kemal's regime upon his death, especially within, I want to say, about a decade after his death.
Yeah, well, there was. I mean, his successor, continued the secularizing agenda, but really, I mean, the big story of Turkey throughout the 20th century is this type of extreme secularism never set well with a fairly pious population, and different political attempts to overthrow it. To undo him were then in turn countermanded by the military and the judiciary and parts of the state bureaucracy that were fairly loyal to what's often just called Kemalism.
Mm-hmm. And so from there, then, we can start looking at, the then USSR, the grandest Soviet Union. So you get the whole Bolshevik Revolution. You get, the October Revolution, and that paves the way for eventually World War II. And you see here there's a real systematic push in different phases for the complete overreach of a secularist government and the complete eradication of a hold of religion in the societal sphere.
Yeah, that's true. We mentioned Lenin earlier, but with Stalin, assuming power after a power struggle with Leon Trotsky, he takes the secularism to extreme levels in the late 1920s and the 1930s with very explicit anti-religious propaganda, the destruction of churches, the creation of what are called museums of atheism that try to portray religion in the worst possible light. Yeah. And also in the 1930s, the secularizing agenda was expanded not just against Orthodoxy, but to other faiths as well in different parts of the Soviet Union, including Judaism, Buddhism, and Islam.
I think we often take for granted historically how systematic the Bolshevik Revolution was, because they also made sure to target the young for their propaganda to hold as they desired. They wanted to make sure that from the ground up, demographically, any notion of religious affiliation and fidelity was completely rooted out.
Yeah, that's right. Both in education and other forms of propaganda, there was this one organization called the League of Atheism, or the League of Godlessness. In 1929, it changed its name to the League of Militant Atheism, and one of the most frequent sort of propaganda images is of a young person sort of looking at this world of Soviet modernity, but having an older babushka portrayed very negatively with like a cross and various other religious symbols, sort of trying to pull the child back to darkness. So that type of propaganda was quite pervasive, and then also historical materialism, Marxism, Leninism became the guiding dogma in education at all levels, essentially.
That's why it's almost laughable, if it wasn't so drastic and cynical, that Stalin's attitude towards the Orthodox Church changed slightly at the outbreak of World War II. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it was a huge pivot, and some have interpreted that as this Orthodox Caesaropapism, trying to marry the church to the state, and it has some trappings of that. But I think the better way to analyze this is what I called earlier conflictual integration, where on the one hand, a certain public recognition of the Orthodox Church. And essentially, he needed to do this in the war context because he recognized Orthodoxy was connected to Russian nationalism, and he wanted to gin that up in what they call the Great Patriotic War. But at the same time, just the level of surveillance and penetration of the state and the security forces within the church in the post-war period was fairly extensive. So, in some ways, you could almost interpret that as keep your friends close but your enemies closer type of move that he pulled off there.
How much did Sputnik and Gagarin have as an influence in terms of propagating these further very anti-religious sentiments across that entire part of the hemisphere?
Yeah, so I mean that pushes up in time a little bit to Khrushchev, and with Sputnik and the Soviet programs, that it did continue the anti-religious atheist propaganda, but it sort of gave it this cosmic dimension that man has traveled to outer space and there's no God there, and sort of a crude propaganda continued, but with this this space or technological dimension as well.
And I guess in some, I know we're not only moving ahead historically, but also expanding geographically. Just very briefly, how much was Asia, Red Asia, as you rightly call it, impacted by the removal of a Judeo-Christian foothold in those countries?
Well, in Asia, certainly after like the 49 revolution in China, there was a real turn against Western missionary, activity at that point. But the Chinese Revolution, and then certainly the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 1970s, was a scorched earth, not just against Christian elements in Asia at the time, but also against Buddhism, Islam, and various salvationist sects. Even the Confucian heritage was targeted at that time. It's, in historical terms, it's, the Chinese situation is a profound clash between tradition and radical.
So we need to stop there, Thomas. My guest has been Thomas Howard. We've been talking about secularist violence. Stay tuned for the next hour. I'm Marcus Peter.